All right, so we're here tonight to talk about Truckee Fire's 2025 Defensible Space Ordinance update. I'm Eric Hornvedt. I'm the Wildfire Prevention Manager with Truckee Fire, joined by Maria and Brittany. And then also listening in on this call out in the field is our Fire Marshal Steve and our Forester Dylan. All right, so we're going to be going into a few different things, but we're going to be talking about background, why we need an update process, do a lot of dives into some highlights, practical implications, and all those type of things. All right, so we're going to first start with some background of some existing code. Sorry, we skipped one slide there. So first background is existing code. So defensible space has been around a long time. As you're seeing here, California Public Resources Code, the state law for defensible space has been around since 1965. So we have 60 years of defensible space history here. That's guided by California Code of Regulations. And then recently, over 2021, in response to the Camp Fire, we had California Assembly Bill 3074 that made some changes to defensible space laws. Last year, we had California Senate Bill 504. And then just as recently as March 1st, we had the governor's emergency proclamation after the LA fires that even is moving to reestablish the acceleration of Zone Zero. We also have some crosswalk with the fire code, which is those of you that are familiar, updates on a 3-year cycle. Coming in a little bit more locally, we have quite a bit of existing code that either is directly related to or ties into defensible space. So here within our fire district in our unincorporated areas of Nevada County and Placer County, we have some hazardous vegetation and combustible material ordinances that are really parallel to what we're proposing in Truckee Fire's ordinance. And then the town of Truckee has a whole bunch of pieces with community development, land use planning, public works, building, plan review, code compliance, development code, building code, municipal code, landscaping standards. So just to get everyone a taste of how many different codes are all involved as we crosswalk these things. Here locally in our community, Truckee Fire even has a long history of having defensible space ordinances. Our current ordinances that we've been using since I started here is Defensible Space Ordinance from 2012, which set forth the defensible space requirements. A fun fact here, when this ordinance was passed in 2012, it actually replaced a suite of 3 ordinances from 1994, 5, and 6, so just a few years after the town of Truckee was incorporated, which means we have over a 30 plus year of having these local defensible space ordinances and, every now and again needing to update these. We also have a property sale disclosure ordinance that was in 2019. And just as a piece of housekeeping, if this 2025 ordinance we're proposing is passed, both of these 2 older ordinances would be rescinded. We also have a ton of community requirements. So these can come through HOAs like Tahoe Donner that use their defensible space covenants and a really well-funded and great defensible space and forestry program. We have numerous communities with defensible space CCNRs, landscaping CCNRs, ARC review committees, tree removal requirements, the list goes on. But plenty of communities, all the big golf course ones are the ones that really come to name, but there's plenty of small HOAs within our fire district that have adopted some sort of CCNR that ties into defensible space. All right, why do we need an update? The main why here is a lot of new legislation. And I say new because a lot of this has been out for a while, and a lot of this legislation is way behind the wildfire problems, the insurance crisis, and everything we're seeing. But the main pieces here with state code, one is AB 38. So this was a piece of legislation passed in 2021 that introduced statewide these property sale disclosure requirements within these very high fire hazard severity zones. And we're at a point where our 2019 ordinance preceded this legislation and isn't perfect. So it's time for us to clean up and get in line with the state. We also had AB 3074 and Senate Bill 504, as I talked about earlier. Both of these were introduced that inspired some changes to defensible space law. So AB 3074 came after the Camp Fire. Senate Bill 504 came last year. And these really affirmed the need for that zone zero around homes and changing up a little bit of the language within the defensible space code to tweak it to avoid home losses. Another unique one that came in and is maybe a little lesser known is Title 10. Title 10 is under the California Code of Regulations, and it provides insurance companies to give discounts for defensible space, home hardening, fire wise, and community level efforts. This piece really hasn't been tapped into that well by the state or by the insurers, but it is another piece that really kind of crosswalks the importance of these defensible space regulations. All right. So what are some of our goals here? One of the ones was codifying zone zero. This has been shown for the last 10 or 15 years by science, by post-fire damage inspections to be the most important zone. So we felt it really important locally to make sure we codify that zone zero is the most important zone, and how do we manage the combustibles that are in this zone to protect homes within our fire district. We also are seeing that this ember resistance is too important to wait. These state guidelines were supposed to have zone zero enacted by 2023, and that's continually pushed farther out. We also want to clarify. We wanted to have an ordinance that provides not only my staff that conducts these inspections, but also provides our residents, our professionals, and our community with a more clear direction. Currently, we're spread out, trying to incorporate best practices from insurance, local ordinances, state regulations, CAL FIRE's website, Truckee Fire's website, what your neighborhood says. And we want to see, getting some better alignment throughout our whole fire district and getting to a better one-stop shop. It's more user-friendly. Everybody's aware of what we need to do to protect our communities. We also need to consolidate. It's pretty unique that our little special fire district serves across two unincorporated counties and for the incorporated town, and with numerous, overlapping and coterminous regulations. So we have an internal goal here of seeing some better standardization of defensible space requirements through all these various levels and having a good best practice code that can be referenced to consolidate these things, especially as we have some parts of our code that supersede the state laws, that integrate in zone zero, outline property sale requirements, address the need for large property and vacant lot fuel reduction requirements, and then make sure that we're building developments that meet these best practices and requirements as well. All in all, my goal is let's plan and protect, right? By planning, by getting a good regulatory framework in place, we can create a wildfire resilient Truckee. And these standards and getting it well integrated so that we're consistently applying these minimum standards across our fire district will help us get that done. Couldn't stop without putting the fire behavior triangle in here. It's a classic joke that fire teaches everything in triangles. But this is the fire behavior triangle. So when we talk about increasing, more intense, larger fires, these are what drive fire behavior. It's fuel, weather, and topography. For most of our inspections, we're not able to change the topography. The neighborhoods and the homes, they already are where they are. The weather, we're not going to be able to change. We're going to have periods of awesome winters, and we're going to have times of cyclical drought, red flag weather, winds, where all we need is an ignition to start a rapid fire spread. But the one thing that we can change is fuel. And Defensible Space really focuses on eliminating the relationship between vegetation, combustible items in your house by breaking up and removing fuel out of this fire triangle. So keep that in mind as we work through this ordinance. We'll be talking about dead vegetation, live vegetation, combustible materials, fences, all of these things that are in our homes and around our homes. And in our fire lens, all of this is called fuel. And if we can remove one aspect of this fire behavior triangle, we can greatly reduce the chance of having fire move through our communities and cause destruction. The other thing I want to talk about is that the fire environment has totally changed. Just since 2012, and I'm using 2012 because that's when our last Defensible Space Ordinance has passed, California has seen 15 of the top most destructive wildfires, 15 of the top largest wildfires, and 9 of the deadliest wildfires. These stats were all sourced from CAL FIRE. And my whole goal here is, since the implementation of our currently utilized 2012 Defensible Space Ordinance, we've seen a profound increase in the size, severity, and destructions of wildfires throughout our home state, throughout the Intermountain West, and globally. I really feel like this does underscore the importance for our district, for our division, and for our community to work together through better standards, that can mitigate and protect life, property, and environment and address this major community risk. This does take a holistic approach to address, and I think there's many fire specialists that would agree that this home ignition problem is solvable if we put in the work at the community level to mitigate, create defensible space, and retrofit our community. All right, now we're going to dig a little bit into our process with this ordinance update. So this process has been carried out for over 16 months with refinement meetings and lots of feedback. I'm not going to give you guys all the nitty-gritty details here, but it started in January 2024, and that's when we had a draft ordinance. Maria sitting on this call knows, I think we were at draft 18 or something before we even went to our stakeholders. So we did think about this a lot, and we engaged with over 60 plus individual partners representing our government partners, HOAs, utilities, our building and planning and OES departments, multiple legal councils, fire agencies, and more. Really wanted this to be, not done in a box. We wanted to have people give feedback, let us understand, let us work with communities like, Martis Camp and Tahoe Donner that have longstanding defensible space programs and receive feedback and get this ordinance into a good spot. Then through all of last year and into this winter, we continued to refine this ordinance. And now I think we've got to nearly 30 preliminary working drafts of trying to get this ordinance somewhere right. We've had multiple meetings with the town of Truckee and other stakeholders before we got it announced to our board. So back just a few weeks ago in April, we provided public notice by having this watermarked draft ordinance circulated to the public in our board agenda and having a discussion only item agenda with our board. And our board, unanimously agreed in discussion to move forward with having this meeting today and then having a series of ordinance hearings, so one in May and one in June, to bring this updated ordinance to our community. Next steps is usually ordinances, the earliest that they would go into effect would be 30 days after it's passed. So that would be the earliest implementation of mid-July. And then, of course, we want to work with our community. So we're going to have a coordinated, collaborative, educational rollout to make sure that our various partners and HOAs and everyone is on this same boat with us. All right, before we dig into the rest of this ordinance, I really just want to do a quick navigating this ordinance. If you happen to be looking at this ordinance in paper form or on another screen, we're going to be moving through the rest of this presentation through sections. So we're going to be going through the preamble, the purpose, and then the rest of this info kind of by number, by section name, and we call it out throughout this presentation. So that should help you stick with us, and you can review anything you've highlighted or have notes of. Hopefully that helps you track where we are and what we're talking about. All right, so the first part is the preamble and the purpose. So our preamble, our whereas statements, really cover our authority, but they also provide more clear context of why this is needed. So we included a few here that we felt were really purposeful. Whereas our fire district is seeking to adopt defensible space regulations that equal or exceed the minimum regulations that are adopted by the state to ensure we can preserve public peace, health, safety, where we know that science has proven that zone 0, sometimes referred to as various different names, is the most important of all defensible space zones, and it does require the most stringent fuel reduction, designed to keep embers from igniting materials that can easily spread fire to the structure, and this zone 0 is the first 5 feet around your house. And fires do threaten the preservation of public peace, health, and safety. They're extremely costly, and it's necessary that cities, counties, special districts, state agencies, federal agencies, and community work together to minimize the threat of fires and become resilient. Our purpose for this ordinance is to provide for the creation of defensible space, not only around structures, but also on unimproved parcels to increase the likelihood that communities, whether or not improved, will survive a wildfire and create safer space for firefighters to operate, right? Having these fuel breaks in defensible spaces even gives suppression resources the ability to safely do their job and protect community. We also think defensible space can help reduce the intensity and rate of spread of a wildfire, increase the likelihood that firefighters contain and extinguish, and also protect animal and plant life within the environment. We also have a purpose of reducing the community fuel loading, removing pest-infested disease, dying dead trees, reducing the density of trees, brush, and other vegetation back to more historical standards where we used to have frequent low-severity fire moving through our environment every 6 to 20 years as that ecological force keeping our environment free and clear of dead material and thinned and well separated, while also improving the health of the wildlands and forests in and around our district. And then also to define and clarify local and state standards for defensible space, fuel reduction, wildfire prevention, and how we go about inspections, disclosures, and other things for properties and penalties for violations. Section 1. So definitions, we're not going to be digging deep into definitions. So if you'd made any note or clarity on definitions, please use the Q&A if you would like to get those in, or raise your hand towards the end. I'm not going to dig into reading every definition to you guys, but feel free to use that Q&A or chat. As we work through every next section of the ordinance, I'm not digging into every single black and white letter of this new ordinance. We're primarily covering the changes from our 2012 ordinance and then the application. So really, what are the changes that's different from maybe how we've been doing it? And then how do we see this being applied? So again, not covering every aspect in detail. Defensible space has been a law in our state since 1965. Much of the language in our ordinance remains consistent with defensible space programs statewide and how Truckee Fire has been educating and positively working with the community for decades. Or as my patch says, since 1894, but who's counting anyway? So digging into our first main meat and potato section of the ordinance, this is defensible space on any real property. The main highlights and practical implications here that are added and maybe more clarified since our last ordinance is utilities and infrastructure, roadsides, driveways, and parking lots, hydrants, propane, and outbuildings. And so what that looks like is that there's already various state and local ordinances or construction standards when these things were originally installed that cover these. But we wanted to consolidate all these into one place and place a responsible party or that person that owns that piece of land to maintain clear access and prevent vegetative growth that creates unsafe conditions. So what that looks like is for roads and driveways, we're looking for 10 feet. So horizontally from the edge of the road, a fuel modification. And that's fuel modification to a Zone 2 defensible space standard that we talk later. But it's not removal of everything. That's creating good spacing between shrubs and trees, limbing trees up above the ground, and having this balance of having vegetation in the zone, but it's vegetation that won't rapidly spread fire to a driveway or roads that people are using during evacuations or that allow equipment access through your neighborhood or into your specific home. We also are going to be making sure we're capturing that 15 feet of vertical clearance. Fire engines and ambulances are pretty dang tall, and we want to make sure we can get to your front door if we need to. There's always going to be an exception for large trees. We love our forests, we love our large trees, so we are not going to be requiring people to remove large trees, over 24 inches that are right next to their driveway or right next to the road. We understand we can work around those. Hydrants, turns out adopting a hydrant isn't just in the winter, digging it out of snow, but it's pretty dang important for firefighters to be able to get a hydrant wrench on it and plug it into a fire engine in the summer. So if you have a fire hydrant on your property, we would like to see a pathway to and 3 feet of clearance around that fire hydrant so our firefighters can use that lovely piece of equipment that the water purveyors maintain for us. And then ground level utilities, right? As a lot of new development and more than about half of the power that the PUD has is now ground based. There's standards for these, and these standards are 3 feet of clearance around the sides of these pad mounted transformers like you're seeing pictured, and then 10 feet of clearance on the access panel or opening side. We're pretty reasonable people, so we left an exemption for fire resilient plants. What we're seeing pictured here, which looks to me like it's probably a dead bitter brush that's been trimmed, is a fire hazardous plant. So is that huge mugo pine shrub behind it. So We just want to see the right plants in the right space and the right place with the right spacing. So we're still trying to make these things work. Another one we learned about after consulting with our utility providers is that these individual service drops to individual homes are commonly not maintained at all. So we just want to see when you have that service line coming down to your house that we're making it so that trees aren't going to grow into it and tree limbs aren't contacting that line. And then if there's any dead trees or hazard trees that could be leaning to, potentially rip that power line off your house or off the pole, that we're getting those hazard trees dealt with. So our practical implications here on utilities and infrastructure is just reinforcing defensible space around critical and community infrastructure, more consistent identification of limbs and trees that could interfere with those service drops to homes, clearly identifying where we need to get to on roadside and driveway and parking lot clearance. And then some new findings on the inspection reports will come out that would be identifying these violations. So where in the past, but this may not have been on the report, now if we saw, say you had a whole line of juniper right along your driveway and your main road of your house, well, that's a fire hazardous plant. We need you to move for that 10 feet of management and get into that more well-managed vegetation. You'd also see hydrant vegetation, pad-mounted transformers, or things like that. And I really wanted to call out that this really is in line with our utility providers' construction standards. So most of this is just a maintenance issue. It was constructed to meet these standards, and now we just need to maintain it. All right, section 3. This is where we're digging into defensible space within 100 feet of a structure. Mainly, this section is just a copy and paste of state law. The place that we go a little bit above and beyond is that the responsible party, so the owner or renter of any real property, needs to comply with these requirements, whether developed or undeveloped. So we're capturing single-family homes and undeveloped parcels that have vegetation near neighboring homes. And I want to call out specifically that this is only for vegetation on the property that that person owns and controls. We're not telling, Maria to go do defensible space on Brittany's vacant lot. We're encouraging community defensible space and saying, hey, Brittany, you own an undeveloped lot in a community that's really close to some of your neighbors' homes. I think we can get you to do just a little bit of our defensible space work to pitch in your part for the community. All right, what we'll be digging into here within these is zone 0, vacant lots, large lots, and community defensible space. So the main new, I'll call it new, we've been educating and talking and inspecting on this item ever since I started at Truckee Fire 3 years ago. But zone 0 in this ordinance is now codified, meaning it's not like, let's get this work done. It's like, no, we have to do this work. So this would be codifying zone 0, and that is managing zone 0, vegetation, stored items, combustible materials, firewood during the summer. So what I do want to dig into first is that zone 0 structure itself includes attached decks, stairs, and porches. We see these on almost every home. They're a combustible attachment, so we use that as part of the structure. In general, when we're providing these recommendations or requirements for zone 0, we're generally measuring 5 feet out from the vertical walls of the structure and then counting the areas underneath decks and stairs and porches, and then 5 feet away from decks, stairs, porches, or other attachments. Where we're at in our ordinance is that we can have no combustibles, no pine needles, no leaves, no, fire hazardous plants, no firewood, no combustible storage. So things like propane tanks and fiberglass paddle boards that you're seeing in the picture on the bottom right. But we really need to get to a non-combustible zone. And we're going to work with our community on well-managed fire-resistant landscaping. We understand that there's a total shift of what we're doing, where we're planting things. So we created a way to work with people, meet them where they're at, and permit some fire-resistant landscaping as long as it's managed in a good way. This also means no stumps, no combustible mulches, so no bark, no shredded bark, no rubber mulches, no firewood in the summer. We're cool with people being Truckee winter people, so we have an exception for firewood in the winter. So when we're not in a declared fire season, you can have your firewood stored in this zone. You just need to seasonally get it out of this zone. And then a big one that's been reinforced by especially the LA fires is no combustible fence or gates. We've already done a full evaluation of how many of these we have. It's about 1,000, maybe 1,400 is the max there. And combustible fences would need to be basically removed or replaced with a non-combustible alternative. This really breaks up that wick of fire being able to move from your fence and then directly connecting to your house, your siding, your window, your eave, anything that's right there. All right, so the practical implications for Zone Zero is that we'd be getting residents, contractors, and realtors, having a clear understanding of what is allowed and what is not allowed within the first 5 feet of a home. We'd be bringing in the no combustible fence or gates, which means removing or replacing. And another implication that we think is a cool one is that we have a home hardening rebate at Truckee Fire that helps out with all this stuff. So we're not just telling you what you can't have or what you need to replace it with, but we're providing some funding to help out with things like Zone Zero hardscaping, upgrading to non-combustible fences or grates, going above and beyond and replacing your vent screening, and everything else that you could do to harden your home. So I had to put in a little pitch there for our home hardening program. Going into section 4, we're going to be talking about defensible space extended zone. So this is where we need more than 100 feet of defensible space. So what this is looking like is when we get into areas that have steep slopes, interesting geographic or local factors, there's times where 100 feet of defensible space is not enough to protect your home. If we don't manage further, say you live in steep slopes with lodgepole pine, well, those produce 100 to 200 foot flame lengths, and that would connect direct flames right back to your house. So there's times where we're evaluating the fuels, the fuel conditions, the topography, and seeing where we could recommend some more here. So this does not auto apply. This really is if we are evaluating those and we give written order through a defensible space inspection or by a fire chief or designee letter that we'd like to see more defensible space. And in general, this is following Zone 2 defensible space standards. So it's just removing dead, separating shrubs, thinning trees, limbing up a little bit, that general fuel reduction separation method. And again, we left it reasonable. We get the forest as part of the ecosystem, and at times removing a dead tree isn't possible. So outside of that 100-foot zone, when we get into these extended areas, we can have some standing snags or wildfire trees, as we call them in the woods, as long as it's only a few per acre and that they're well spaced from other vegetation and don't pose a significant or reasonable falling hazard. Again, being reasonable, fire chief or designee can consider it a phased approach as we work into this larger extended zone. So we can receive some feedback, work with this property owner, and work through a time period of understanding it takes time to get these conditions done right. So this is a picture of a forestry project. This is not what we expect from every single person in terms of defensible space, right? This is what we're out there doing on forestry work. But really the impetus behind this zone, the extended Zone Zero, is really starting to encourage responsible land stewardship for our large lot owners. You bought a beautiful piece of the Tahoe National Forest right here in Truckee or the Donner Summit area. And we want to see you carry that responsible land stewardship forward, maintain healthy forests, maintain conditions that we're not going to have fire come through and, catastrophically remove every single tree and spread into our communities. So that's our goal. We'll identify it where we need it to protect homes, but the goal is to just encourage this positive, ideal stewardship. Okay, digging into section 5 of this ordinance, we get into critical infrastructure. So we've been working with a lot of our partners on critical infrastructure, and these are things that our fire chief and fire marshal really think about is what are these lifelines that are critical to our community, right? Hospitals, schools, police stations, fire stations, any of these, and where these things are critical infrastructure, we determine that, and we want to make sure that we have defensible space at least 100 feet, ideally all the way out to 200 feet around that property if they own that much distance. So just keep that in mind as we're working through this. This is really just trying to make sure that we identified critical infrastructure in this ordinance and that we're taking it seriously to see that this infrastructure is well protected. Section 8 gets into new development. This section is relatively short, but the purpose of new development was an opportunity to combine best practices with current requirements. And so this is getting defensible space done on plan review and then an inspection prior to final on single family residential or any large development. This would mean zone 0 needs to be applied. And then if you get into a more complex environment, you're talking to our fire marshal and working through fire code and fire safe regulations and those type of things as well. So the practical implication for this is that new development would require some coordinated rollout with our HOAs, right? We recognize that a lot of development before it even gets to the county or town building department goes through their own architect review committee or those type of roles. So we do recognize that's one practical implication is some clear rollout with our HOAs and architect review committees, building and planning departments, and then as well as our contractors, our general contractors, and our landscapers, right? Make sure that everyone that's involved in designing the house, permitting the house, or installing the home in the landscaping is that we're all on the same page with defensible space way balanced in. Section 7 is real estate. So what we did with this section is basically get Truckee Fire back online with the state requirements of AB 38. So this ordinance, has a little bit of clarifications that we need to see a valid and compliant inspection report within 6 months preceding the date of transaction. So no partially or seasonally compliant inspections. The real responsibility is intending for the seller to bring the property into compliance before they sell it. But we're not going to stop up a property sale transaction. AB 38 doesn't, our ordinance doesn't either. There is a process where, just like any other inspection in a real estate transaction, can allow the buyer and seller to enter into an agreement where the buyer takes responsibility to do the work. So like AB 38, vacant lots, commercials, moderate, these won't be subject to these disclosures. And I wanted to add in here that Maria has done an awesome job working with our real estate community over the last couple of years to make sure that we're getting our realtors and everyone in our professional community dialed in. So the practical implication here is that we'll have clarity for buyers and sellers and realtors on the process. We won't be doing this dance between a 2019 Truckee Fire Ordinance and an AB 38 2021 state law. We'll just be requiring these inspections for single family residential, 1 to 4 units, have the disclosure, try to get these things compliant before they sell. If not, work with the new homeowners in our community to bring them into compliance. All right, sections 8, 9, 10, and 11, we go into exemptions, final authority, violations, and appeals. So exemptions from this ordinance, we did create a really clear and simple exemptions for rare, threatened, or endangered species. So the district's clearly exempting any parcel that is, determined and or confirmed by the district that there's habitat for endangered or threatened species, or has historical or archaeological significance, or is declared exempt by state or federal law. So this is just a catch-all, is that, we're not going to police pine needles everywhere. We get it. There's some areas that need to be treated different. And then another one we put in really hyper-specific to our Truckee Mountain community is this winter firewood exemption. Is that we recognize the climate of our region, the number of residences that rely or solely rely on wood burning stoves for heat, that we put in this seasonal exemption. So whenever there is no state or local declaration of a burn ban in effect, as determined by CAL FIRE or Truckee Fire, you can have this split seasoned usable firewood in any of these defensible space zones for you to use. I will say the one caveat we put in is split, seasoned, usable, stacked. So when we see, a 10-foot by 100-foot pile of gray, cracking, rotting rounds underneath of a deck of a home, that's got to go. So let's keep that in mind. We want to work with the community, but we don't want to do it. A neat fun fact for those people on this call that are defensible space nerds like us is 1 cord of lodgepole firewood produces the same BTUs, the same heat as 175 gallons of gasoline. So when that stuff ignites, it produces a tremendous amount of heat. You can understand as a firefighter formerly here, we wouldn't want to see you store 175 gallons of gasoline next to your house. And I think usually when we talk through that with people, they start to understand why that firewood needs to go during the summer months. Final authority, this is pretty carryover language, but really final authority on this ordinance lays to Truckee Fire and our fire chief. So we do put that in there. We do say that we can permit some additional exemptions or require some additional mitigations based on specific circumstances. And two pieces here that, love it or hate it, I really wanted to put these in here to show you where we're at. 9.2 is the good faith compliance. Our opinion is that we're not trying to penalize our community. We're trying to get this Defensible Space Ordinance in place, gets the regulatory framework for what needs to be done, meet our community where they're at, and work towards getting a resilient community. So we want to see good faith compliance, not intending to penalize our property owners, and that keep everyone working towards making this good faith, solid effort to comply with the requirements. We also have a no duty to enforce. This is copy and pasted from the county's ordinances. This is more some legal stuff here, but we do have a no duty to enforce where nothing in this ordinance imposes on the fire district, fire chief, or any other enforcement official of the town, county, or special district or public agency to issue a notice of violation or to abate any violations or held liable for failure. So this is pretty normal that you see, and we run into some unique situations with the community where sometimes you need to have this clause in an ordinance. Enforcement. Some of you are going to love this next statement. Some of you won't. We have a clear channel to enforce through this ordinance. That is cited here of how we can cite violations through health and safety code as adopted for our fire district and the ordinance we have. But our goal is to not be an enforcement agency at this time, right? We want to work with the community, enforce through new construction, short-term rentals, property sales, right? These clear avenues to enforce, continue this cycle of providing inspections, providing education, providing an opportunity for homeowners to do the right work and get it done. And as we move forward, maybe we will have to start enforcing, but that's not the primary goal of this ordinance. The other piece is in appeals. We have our whole appeals process, a resolution that we had from Truckee Fire in here. So if anything in this ordinance as cited is felt incorrect or overbearing, we do have an appeals process, which is quite standard for these. All right, hang with me before we move on to any questions. I wanted to run through a comparison chart. This might look like just a bunch of gobbledygook, but where I'm going to start is with the zone and the item. So we don't have everything on here. This is just a really good snapshot, is that we looked really closely at all these different regulatory frameworks. And so we have zone 0 here, so vegetation, landscaping, combustibles, outbuildings, zone 1. And what we did is we compared state. So back to that public resource code, section 4291. We compared that to the new zone 0 regulation. And if those of you haven't been tracking, there's a Board of Forestry and CAL FIRE working group working to create the new guidelines for zone 0. And where they're at is nothing within 5 feet of your house except a couple potted plants, but the pot can only be 5 gallons. There's very specifics about what plants, type, and size you can have and where these pots are. Pretty challenging to roll out in an existing community. And that you can't even have an outbuilding within 30 feet of your house unless it meets the same Chapter 7A Wildland Urban Interface building standards that new homes have to meet. So that's where the state's headed with Zone 0. What I wanted to really focus in on with this comparison is our ordinance. So where we're at, where we're more restrictive, are these darker gray areas. And so you can see my cursor up here, is that subject properties. The area that we go above and beyond state standards here is that we really feel like defensible space applies to any real property in our developed neighborhoods. So that is developed homes, single family residential, any structures, ADUs, vacant lot. those areas of large lots next to developed lots next door. So we really wanted to encourage this community defensible space. That's a carryover from what Truckee Fire's ordinance did in 2012, and it's a carryover for what Nevada County and Placer County require in their hazardous vegetation ordinances as well. So it's a little bit more stringent than the state, but it's generally in line with our counties and where Truckee Fire has been with defensible space for the last 13 years. The rest of our ordinance, as you're seeing this lighter gray color that matches the rest, is generally in line with the requirements of the state and these new Zone 0 requirements that are headed through the state pipeline right now. Or in other words, I want to highlight that we were not intending or trying to put forward an updated defensible space ordinance that was crazily more hard to meet, hard to comply, more stringent. We recognize the balance for fire-resistant landscaping, for vegetation near driveways, for people balancing landscaping and defensible space in their home area. So we really tried to get to a spot that we have a good regulatory framework, is not way more stringent than state requirements, and that balances all these things through some good language. The last chart here on the far right, where you see IBHS Wildfire Prepared Home, this is the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, or in fire nerd terms, this is the arm of looking at science and doing all the modeling for insurance. So if you've ever seen a video of an ember generator burning down a home in a controlled environment, it's all IBHS. And IBHS has created a program a couple years ago called Wildfire Prepared Home. This is really the best of the best. They did this through, like I said, data science, post-fire damage inspections, consulting with some heavy hitters in the insurance industry. And every single thing they recommend is more stringent than all of the ordinance that Truckee Fire is passing. This is tough. I would love our community to get to a point that we could get every single home, all 15,000 of them, to meet this IBHS Wildfire Prepared Home designation, but it's challenging. As you can see in some of these, it like clearly identifies that defensible space exposures across property lines must be addressed, meaning that you can't receive this designation unless your neighbor has good defensible space. Zone 0, nothing. You just cannot have a single thing. No vegetation, no debris, no plants. All you can have is rocks, cement, anything hardscaping. Trees, you can't even have one. They think Zone 0, it goes 5 feet from the house and then vertically up. So you can't have a tree in Zone 0 or any limbs that even extend into Zone 0, meaning no limbs that would even extend over your roof. Our ordinance, we allow that. We're working with these large trees in our communities. I'm using thinning where needed, removal where needed, or just good limbing, right? Getting these tree limbs separated 10 feet from your house. Combustible items, object, and materials. IBHS, Wildfire Prepared Home, best practice for insurance, says don't. You can't have objects, hot tubs, saunas, vehicles, boats, RVs, no potted plants, no trash cans, no furniture, dog houses, no sheds, no leaning lawn tools. They literally say you cannot qualify for our program if a broom or a rake is leaning against your house, and that's an old Jack Cohen quote. And we're going to work with people. We want to see this stuff removed, reduced, relocated, or replaced with non-combustibles. That's the language we used. And then relocate, right? You can move that stuff a little bit farther away. We don't really perfectly address where outbuildings can and can't be. We just want to see management around them. If you want to meet Wildfire Prepared Home, you can't have an outbuilding within 30 feet of your house. So no attachments, no sheds, no lean-tos, no anything. So just wanted to run through that with you all just to see kind of where the insurance industry is, how we're trying to meet the community where it's at and balance minimum requirements for state law, get it up to somewhere better and move our community towards being insurable, and helping us battle these wildfire losses, increasing wildfire risks, and total insurance nightmare that the whole state is currently in. So with that, I wanted to show you guys all a few other best practice resources. So these are all things we looked at while we were preparing these ordinances, and they're ones I'm sure many of these people heard of, but we provided some links here so we can share these slides with everyone so you have it. But Wildfire Prepared Home is really that really good one from the insurance industry. It's an awesome program to look into. There's an awesome website called defensiblespace.org. Really great text and pictures and images guiding, really nationally how to create defensible space. And then recently, some two new ones that came out this winter and early spring is seeing like what does a wildfire resistant house look like and what does wildfire resilient landscaping look like. So Scientific American put together a really good article, really cool models of homes. And then IBHS, again, along with some others, did a resilient landscaping competition to really start showing people in that architect and engineering world, what does wildfire resilient landscaping look like? So cool stuff in here. Here's the wildfire prepared home. This is a glimpse of what that defensiblespace.org website looks like. Really easy to understand, great graphics, great pictures. Here's the what does a wildfire resilient home look like, right? We got the gravel, the non-combustible, movable potted plants, movable non-combustible furniture, movable trash cans, non-combustible fencing and gates, all that. And then a little snapshot of these landscape designs. So showing you, kind of the forward thinking of where are our architects and engineers and those type of folks thinking about balancing all these requirements and still getting some good aesthetics in place. All right, with that, I'm going to leave it up to this group. We're going to be looking through the chat, the Q&A, and people please raise your hand if you'd like us to get your mic up so you can ask questions, provide us comments, give us feedback. And we really wanted to have this community info meeting so we can hear where the community's at, get some forward thinking comments, questions, feedback, and then internally look at our ordinance, our draft, and maybe provide some refinements and get an updated piece back to our board. And before we end this call, we will have one more slide that covers our proposed next steps. All right, it looks like we have Kathy in here. Hey, Kathy, I allowed your microphone, so you should be able to unmute on your side and jump on in. Hey, Kathy, if you see a microphone icon, it should be, in the top or the bottom, depending on how you have it open. If you unmute, you should be good to provide a comment.
Okay, thank you. I was trying to do the one on the screen. That wasn't working for me. So anyway, thanks, Eric, for the presentation. I do appreciate that you've added some driveway stuff in there because I've noticed that's been missing. And so I do think that's really important for ingress and egress. But I am wondering where the 24-inch tree came from for the driveway, and how did you settle on that size?
No, thank you. That's a great question here. So the 24 inches it's a pretty general forestry term that 24-inch trees usually considered, a mature, a large, an old growth tree in our region. And where this really actually came from was some early roadside vegetation management projects that the fire district and a CAL FIRE grant in the town of Truckee were working on. And the community did not have a strong appetite to see these lovely, big, beautiful character trees removed right next to the public roadways or driveways. And so this just was to provide a clear exception that large trees are not the driver of fire behavior, right? It really is the dead and the surface fuels that drive fire behavior. So we wanted to provide, a clear exception in here that if someone does not want to remove a large tree, they do not have to. What I will say is that we have done some roadside vegetation management projects by the fire district where removing large trees next to the road can be a good thing to do, right? For snow removal equipment, for equipment access, just to get a more clear zone, but again, not required. So hopefully that helps answer your question.
Yeah, a little bit, but when we're talking about driveways, I mean, I don't think we have to worry about public snow removal. I mean, that's up to the homeowner. And, science tells us that trees greater than 16 inches or 16 inches or greater do not contribute to fire behavior. And if you're worried about fire behavior, I would suggest that you bring that 24 inches down. And elsewhere in your ordinance, you define a large tree as 14 inches and greater. So, that's what I would suggest that you stay with, because, since I read this ordinance and just going around the neighborhood, and I see plenty of examples of trees that are isolated, that are smaller than 24 inches on someone's driveway and aren't going to be a problem. And so I really would ask you to take a look at that, because I think you're literally talking about removing thousands of trees throughout this community near people's driveways that are less than 24 inches.
Got it. That is a great comment, Kathy. We will look back at our large tree definition in this one and make sure we have just good alignment for clarity there. And one piece I do want to just provide you just some conversational clarity on is that looking at, I'm getting a little nerdy here, section 2.3.1, roadside fuel modification. So the standards for around driveways, roads, and parking lots. We're not saying that you have to have 10 feet of clearance with no vegetation from the edges of roadways, drivings, or parking lots. We're actually asking that you follow zone 2 reduced fuel requirements. So the same work you would do within 30 to 100 feet of your home, right? It's removing small diameter trees, ladder fuels, shrubs, creating separation between trees. That's what we're looking for. So most of the time, we wouldn't be saying, hey, Kathy, you have to remove every tree within 10 feet of your driveway that is less than 24 inches. We would actually be saying, hey, Kathy, we need to do just a little bit of shrub separation, a little bit of tree limbing, and maybe remove a couple of these trees to get some better canopy spacing within this 10-foot area of the roadway or driveway. So I hope that helps clarify where we have the language in there. And then I appreciate your comment on making sure we're consistent with the definition of large trees.
And then if you could just go back then and look at what you say about driveways and 24-inch trees, because it does say 24 inches and greater. And if you clarified that to put in some of that zone 2, to where that might not always be the case, that you're taking out all the trees less than that, it could clarify that. So that's just a comment.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Kathy.
And since I don't see any other hands raised, I just have one more question. You talked about how important it is to, work with the contractors, the realtors, the public. And I'm just wondering, like on this meeting here, did you specifically reach out to the Contractors Association, the Realtors Association, Firewise community leaders? How are people supposed to know about this meeting?
Great question. So I do not have the whole distribution list right in front of me. I'll make sure we have that compiled before we go to our board. But yeah, we did advertise this and had it on our board agenda. So right, that's just a general public notice in a board packet. And then I know we definitely utilized our big list of stakeholders that we had, which was over 60 emails with various government agencies, so county, town, all those, our utilities, our HOAs. And then we did send out an active email to our Firewise and HOAs email list. I do not have the perfect answer if we actively sent an email out specific to the target audience of contractors, but I'll make sure that we follow up on that.
Thanks very much.
All right. Well, before we move on, I just want to give another opportunity if anyone else wants to put anything in the Q&A or raise their hand to provide any other questions or comments or anything like that. I'm seeing one more in the chat. Cool. Well, I will jump into the one that we have in the Q&A section here. So this is for Dylan Sisney. Thanks for the presentation. How do you plan to regulate the non-combustible fencing requirement? Does the fence need to be non-combustible only within 5 feet of the home? would a 5 feet or more non-combustible break in the fence within zone 1 be sufficient? So great question. I'll ask you, we can have you clarify if you want, but the plan here is just to identify where we have combustible fences or gates within zone 0. So attached to the house. This is directly related to home losses, IBHS risks, and exactly where the Zone 0 law is going with the state as well. So we're going to work with people on this one. We're going to identify them. Hopefully they can use our home hardening rebate program to retrofit, but you actually need to remove or replace that first 5 feet. So take away the wooden fence, replace with a 5 foot or larger panel of metal or chain link or any of those non-combustible types of fence. And no, a 5 foot break elsewhere would not count because then you still have a pretty thin kindling of a fence directly attached to your house. Pine needles and combustibles get in that zone. You still have a quick and easy pathway for an ember to ignite that fence and then still bring fire to the home. So we would be focused in on that wooden attachment zone within zone 0. And Dylan, if you have anything else you want to say on that, you can hit the unmute yourself on your screen to provide some additional discussion here. All right, we got one more from Jason Hyduk here in the chat. So landscaping is allowed in zone 0 or all combustible. Our language in this ordinance is really trying to crosswalk a reasonable approach to zone 0 and then balance where the state is going to head with the zone 0 laws. So we are going to basically push for having nothing in zone 0, right? It really is trying to get to a non-combustible zone, a hardscaped area, 5 feet from your house, under your decks and stairs, and 5 feet away from your decks and your stairs. But with that, we're trying to be reasonable and working with the community and providing an exception for fire resilient landscaping that's maintained in a way that it won't likely be ignited by embers and create a pathway to spread fire to the structure. So an example of this would be maybe someone has a flower bed and they replace the wooden border to a non-combustible border. They replace the combustible mulch, the bark they used to have, with rock, and then they can keep their bulbs, their daffodils, and their lilies that were growing in that area, as those generally are maintained in a way that it wouldn't rapidly ignite and spread fire to the home. So not saying go do that at every house, but just trying to provide a practicable example of how we're trying to kind of balance this zone 0 rollout with our community.
Hey, Eric, popping in here with a question from the Q&A from Carol Cumming. Carol says, you are mostly making this for property owners. How will you be working with and communicating with HOAs, water companies, etc., like ours in Kingvale?
Yeah, great question, Carol. And yeah, we definitely did focus in this presentation more on the application of the ordinance for property owners, as that's generally who's impacted the most. But defensible space does apply to anyone that operates, leases, or controls a building or structure in these areas. So it does apply to any building or structure. And our main goal is to try to work with the community at every level. So, we have our 3-year inspection program to engage with every property owner. We have almost 90% of our homes in Firewise communities. So we've been working with our Firewise communities and our HOAs, our utilities, and our water companies. So I think our whole team is super apt and available. We're trying to identify all these issues that need to be mitigated as much as we can. And I think we're able and willing to be approached and communicated with from everyone as well. So water companies, unique is that we're trying to say that fire hydrants are a community asset, right? It's a community infrastructure. So if you have a house that has a fire hydrant in your front yard, like mine does where I live, man, mine has nothing around it for, I think, 10 feet. It's super clean and clear. I make sure it stays the right color red and everything. So that's like the goal, right? Let's work with every community member we can and try to get people to see that these defensible space, these fire threats, these fire hazards are a community issue, and we all need to work together as a community to address them. So any specific questions or ways that you'd like to work with the fire district, Carol, keep plugging in with us. Your community in Kingville has been awesome to work with. All right, well, I will take one more long pause. Oh, Kathy has her hand up. Or was it still up from last time? Go ahead, Kathy, if you have more to say.
No, well, I thought I wanted to give other people some opportunities, so I didn't want to take up too much time, but I was confused, and I don't think we have to settle it right now, but I would ask you to look the outbuilding stuff. I didn't really understand the difference between what you want in 10 feet and what you want in the next 10 feet. It all sounded the same to me, like in 20 feet around a building. And it also makes the assumption that every outbuilding is, worse than a regular building because it's not necessarily permitted. But we do have like some metal structures and things like that that should be considered. So I would just ask you to look at the outbuilding stuff a little bit closer, see what you're trying to say between the 10 feet and the 20 feet. And what about, metal or some other fire resistance outbuildings?
Yeah, I'm super appreciative of you bringing that one up. That's came up with our stakeholders as well, and my hands are tied with that language. This language is a copy and paste from Public Resource Code 4291. That their language is that you need to have 10 feet of clearance from vegetative fuel and items cleared down to a non-combustible surface, and then no vegetative fuel or combustible items for additional 10 feet. So this is a tough one. This is where I think we have a piece of state law that's not worded very well. And when we come forward with local legislation, right, we're not allowed to become less restrictive, right? We can't adopt standards that do not meet the intent of the state law that's currently written. So this is one we work with people. I use our reports, our pictures, our recommendations. We're really just looking for similar standing. Like, let's get zone 0 around our outbuildings in a nice 10-foot area that's not going to rapidly spread fire from nearby vegetation or pine needles to the outbuildings. And you hit the nail on the head. And a lot of these smaller fires that butt up against our WUI communities, generally, if you look towards the reports, you'll see more outbuildings or other structures lost than primary residences because they're built to a lower standard. They have void spaces under them. They accumulate a lot of pine needles and debris and do ignite much easier than a home typically does. So this is a tough one for me to try to fix because this was a copy and paste from our state code. And we do our best during our inspection process to clearly break down what action we're looking for the community member that has that outbuilding.
Okay, thanks very much.
All right, well, I'm going to give one more awkward silence pause for anyone to raise their hand or put a question in the chat and Q&A before we move on to our last slide with next steps in process. All right, well, seeing none there. So our next steps in process here is that today's meeting was intended to have a community info webinar. We'll be taking the feedback, the questions, the comments we received thoughtfully and looking into our ordinance language. We'll be making sure that we do a good job of reaching out to all of our groups, as Kathy mentioned, about the upcoming ordinance hearing. And what these ordinances look like, it's actually a two-step. So for Truckee Fire to consider passing an ordinance, we have to go through a full requirement of doing a public notice of a hearing. So there'll be Updates coming out, I think it's for 3 weeks before our board meeting, specifically announcing that we'll be having an ordinance hearing on this defensible space ordinance within our local newspapers, as well as all of our normal board packet posting requirements, and some additional emails, outreach, trying to hit all of our target audiences and communities and contractors. Our first ordinance hearing and reading would happen at our May 20th Truckee Fire Board meeting. Now, these meetings are held at 5:30 p.m. at the Truckee Sanitary District off Yoga Road. Following the outcome of that meeting, if the board chooses to move forward, then we'd have a second ordinance hearing at the June board meeting. Assuming that the board would choose to pass an ordinance, then we'd be working out coordinating and collaborating rollout with our community. So agencies, stakeholders, HOAs, any of those that we'd be working with on educating on these new requirements that are in our district. And the date that the ordinance goes into effect is up to our board. The earliest it can go into effect would be 30 days after it is passed, which would be July 17th. But our board or staff could choose to set that date later. So that way the ordinance is passed and the effective date, gives some more time for it to be absorbed before it comes into legal effect. So that just gives you guys an idea of next steps. And with that, I just wanted to say thank you. We're ending a little bit early so everyone can have back 50 minutes of their beautiful Thursday evening and enjoy a little bit of spring weather before it snows.
Hey, Eric, real quick, we have one additional comment from Dylan Sisney. He said, I didn't see much in this ordinance with language regarding the first 6 inches of siding being non-combustible. Is that included somewhere?
The short answer is, I believe, yes. That's 6 inches of non-combustible siding, or, typically that's your exposed cement foundation or stem wall, is included in here. And I appreciate you noticing that. If for some reason it's not, we will make sure to get that covered as an update before it goes to our board. All right, and with that, I'll say thank you to everyone. Please feel free to reach out if you have our contact info. That would be, great. You can also just use our website or our Defensible Space page to get a hold of us. Happy to talk to anyone in our community, and we welcome everyone to our board meetings for the ordinance readings as well. Thank you so much.